These things right here, these things can cause more than enough trouble all on their own. They definitely do not need help from a curse. Hi everybody, it's Sarah from Hushed Up History, and today we are going to Nevada. When gold was discovered in California on January 24th, 1848, the ripple effect was felt throughout the country, and thousands upon thousands upon thousands of people uprooted their lives to move out west looking for fortune. But California was not the only place where the earth was offering dreams of financial fortune. By 1859, a little more than a decade later, many dreams had already been shattered. But then there was the discovery of the Comstock Lode, a massive deposit of silver ore that completely transformed Virginia City, Nevada. Once a small town, now thousands and thousands of people made their way to Virginia City, many of which were prospectors, now driven by their reignited dreams of finding fortune under the earth. But it wasn't just prospectors. Anybody from anywhere for any reason found their way to Virginia City, and it transformed it into a place where the law didn't really exist and you were brave to walk the streets. Filled to the brim with bordellos, saloons, and opium dens, it quickly became the darkest definition of the Wild West, where crime ran rampant. Greed, dreams, and human beings all swept through Virginia City at an alarming rate. But there was one thing, surprisingly, that many people had in common, and that was an obsession with a card game called Faro. Played using only one deck of cards and being fairly easy to learn, gamblers quickly made Faro the dominant card game in every gambling hall in the West. And one person who was particularly well versed in the game was a Virginia City man named Black Jake, and he had a plan to take advantage of the game's popularity. He bought himself a Faro card table and planned to use that table to take as much money out of as many pockets as humanly possible. Black Jake was known for being a very greedy man, but one night in 1861, karma came back strong, and the table turned on its owner. He lost multiple hands and the equivalent of $70,000, which would today be about $2 million, in one night, with no way to pay back the debt. While sitting at his card table, he took out his pistol and paid with his life. With Black Jake now gone, the table needed a new home, and it found one several years later with a man whose name, unfortunately, has been lost to time. But he only had the table for one night, and that is because over the course of the evening, he too lost every penny to his name and his life. Having now taken 2 lives in a relatively short period of time, the card table was put into storage in the back of the building where it was last used, the Delta Saloon in Virginia City. And it stayed there undisturbed for decades until the late 1890s when a wealthy businessman named Charles Fosgard saw it, and he instantly wanted to buy it. Fosgard already had plenty of money, but he was looking to reinvest it. And being in Virginia City, filled to the brim with thrill-seeking gamblers who were looking to make their fortunes in the saloons when they couldn't in the mines, it made perfect sense to him to bring the card table out of retirement. He remodeled it as a blackjack table, and he was in business. One night, a drunk miner sauntered on into the Delta Saloon and made his way over to Fosgard's blackjack table, and he was thrilled to see him. He was even more thrilled when the miner went on to lose hand after hand after hand, until he only had one last thing to bet with: his gold ring. The miner bet his gold ring against a $5 coin, and he won. And then he won again. And then he won again, and then he won again. The miner and Fosgard went face to face over and over and over again, and a crowd began to form to watch as the businessman was slowly forced to hand over everything: piece by piece. By the end of the night, the miner was the new owner of Fosgard's stagecoach, his portion of a local gold mine, and what today would equate to $2.5 million in Fosgard's money. Fosgard's fortune was decimated, and in his dismay, he did the only thing he could think to do. He took out his pistol and, standing at the card table, took his own life in the same manner as the card table's previous two owners. The table was now soaked in more than enough tragedy, and it was finally put out of commission with its dubious new nickname of the suicide table. But over the years, as the population of Virginia City declined, the story of the table only grew in popularity. And eventually, the table was brought out and put on display, now being a feature of the Delta Saloon. The Delta Saloon, portions of Virginia City, and the infamous card table were all restored, with the table being restored back to being a faro table as it had been in the 1800s. The table remained an attraction at the Delta Saloon for decades. It saw in a new century, and it sat in its spot quietly with all of its history and tragedy alongside it. And it has a lot of visitors, with people being directed inside the building to go see it by a very cheerful sign hanging by the front door. Then, on March 11th, 2019, the Delta Saloon and the surrounding region was shaken by a gas explosion. And when the smoke cleared and people started to survey the damage, they found the cursed table, sitting in its spot, completely unscathed other than a thin layer of dust. Movers were brought in, and the table was relocated to its sister establishment, the Bonanza Saloon, directly across the street. And today, it remains there on display under a protective plastic housing. In a time and place that fully encompassed the lawlessness of the American West, like Virginia City, there are many, many stories to tell. But standing among them all is a simple card table, created as a game of chance and now linked to multiple lives lost in the bloody name of greed. Never mind. Hi everybody, it's Sarah from Hushed Up History. And would you share your beverage with a dead guy? When a place is called Canyon Diablo, you can only assume that it earned that name for a reason, especially when it looks as bad as it sounds. The Arizona Chasm is huge and seemingly just comes out of nowhere, the site of a former railroad town that has stories of every character and every type of drama associated with the Old West. And yes, its origin is a little unusual. It's a community that was formed in December of 1881 when railway workers had to stop laying new tracks because they stumbled on this giant hole in the ground, and they realized they couldn't go any further until after a bridge was built. But the stories of Canyon Diablo, with blood running down its street, an air thick with violence, and a graveyard that simply ran out of room to bury people, are not true, and they were written by a fiction writer long after the heyday of the town. There is one story, though, that absolutely is true, and it is just as gruesome and bizarre as anything any fiction writer could pen. It was after 1 a.m. on April 8, 1905, in the Wigwam Saloon located in Winslow, Arizona, and the liquor was still flowing freely through the saloon and through the thoughts of John Shaw and William Evans when they walked into the building that night. They ordered their drinks, but they left them on the bar when they noticed a dice table nearby, and the glitter of silver dollars caught their eye and brought them over. Nothing initially would have seemed suspicious. Here were two young men dressed in suits, approaching the dice table in between drinks at the saloon that evening. But when they took out their guns, they made their intentions very clear. They gave everyone around the table the same dire warning and then left the saloon and walked off into the night after robbing everyone of approximately $200. When Navajo County Sheriff Chet Hoke and Deputy Pete Pemberton set off to look for the thieves, it looked like it was going to be relatively easy. They had left a trail of coins that led the two directly to the railroad tracks. They then followed the railroad tracks for 25 miles before they found themselves in Canyon Diablo. Once inside the old town, the two went in to speak to trading post operator Fred Voles to see if he had seen the two thieves anywhere in the vicinity. But they didn't have to wait long for answers. While speaking to Voles, the two thieves walked up directly behind them. The men exchanged a few words, but soon guns were drawn and the scene was enveloped by smoke and bullets. The fighting was extremely close, with Shaw and Hoke only a few feet apart, and it turned out that this would be Shaw's undoing. 21 bullets were fired at Shaw, but one struck him in the head, killing him. There were injuries sustained all around, but he was the only one that died in the shootout. Voles, who was still in the trading post while this was all unfolding, then provided a simple, plain pine box for the body of Shaw, and he was quickly buried near where he fell on the property. Word of this encounter traveled fast, and by the following night, the story was already circulating in the Wigwam Saloon, where it was heard by members of an Arizona cattle outfit who had stopped there along their way. Going head-to-head with law enforcement was nothing new to this cattle outfit. What shocked them was that Shaw had ordered another drink before walking over to the dice table, but when he left the building after robbing them, his last drink was left on the bar untouched. Shaw not getting to enjoy his last drink was completely unacceptable to this group. They all grabbed whiskey bottles, left the saloon, and went to wait for the next train to Canyon Diablo. Voles was probably still shaken about the gunfight the night before when he was suddenly woken up by the sound of loud banging on his door. When he got to his door, he was met by a mob of people armed with liquor bottles demanding to know where Shaw was buried. They told him that Shaw had never gotten to enjoy his last drink. They had the liquor, now they needed Shaw. As disturbed as Voles may have been from their demands, he gave in and handed them the shovels they were asking for. He also gave them a camera and told them that photos of the dead man would help to properly identify him. The plan was fairly simple: dig up the body of Shaw and have a last drink with him. As stated later by Lucian Cresswell, quote, "We stopped at the depot and had a few more drinks, and then we went and dug the grave open with shovels." Amazingly, despite his violent end, Shaw looked surprisingly natural and normal laying in his grave. But when they saw him in his final place of rest, the situation became much more serious to everyone gathered. Wagon boss J.D. Rogers instructed everyone to take him out of the grave, telling them, quote, "Let's get him out. Let's give him a drink and put him away proper. Someone can say a prayer," which was not done when they put him in the hole. Two men jumped into the grave and lifted the body up to those waiting above. They then took Shaw's body and propped him up against a fence. His eyes were open, his face was fixed in a permanent grin, and each of them took the liquor bottles and put them up against his teeth before pouring the alcohol down the dead man's throat. Shaw finally got to enjoy his last drink. After all of the liquor was gone, the men solemnly put John Shaw back in his coffin. They placed a liquor bottle on his chest and said some hasty words before reburying him. Throughout the ceremony, 6 photographs were taken, and when the camera was returned to Voles, he took the film out and handed it back to Cresswell, instructing him to give it back to Sheriff Hoke when he returned to town. However, another man in attendance by the name of Sam Case had a very different idea of what was going to happen to these photographs. Case had a grudge against Hoke's brother, and on the way back to town, he confronted Cresswell and took the film, telling him Hoke ain't going to get no pictures. From here, the roll of film passed from hand to person, carrying the story of John Shaw along with it. Finally, a month after the impromptu funeral at Canyon Diablo, Case had the film roll back in his possession, and he handed it over to an attorney. The attorney then handed it to his son. These photographs would not see the light of day for years, until after they had somehow come into the possession of a man named Gladwell Richardson, who wrote a story about them in a 1965 issue of Arizona Highways magazine. Today, 4 of the photographs taken at the last drink of John Shaw are owned by the Arizona Historical Society as part of their John Shaw collection. The remaining 2 photographs are missing. Canyon Diablo is filled with myths and legends all about the horrors of the Wild West, most of which have been debunked. But we have photographic proof of one story that is true, the story of the corpse that was dug up to enjoy one last drink.